Hello, and welcome to our latest LGIU interview. I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, the Local Government Information Unit. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to another one of these interviews where we sit down with local government leaders, with experts, with chief execs, with researchers, and try and get some insight into what's happening across the sector. I'm delighted that today we're sitting down with an old friend of LGIU, Dr. Mark Sandford, who's senior researcher at the House of Commons Library. He specializes in local government and devolution. And his work includes scoping, researching, writing, really getting into detail of government bills in the House of Commons and in wider local government issues. He'll be known to many listeners and viewers as a prolific speaker and writer on these things. He's previously been a research fellow with the Constitution Unit. He's worked for the Electoral Commission, so he has a really great insight across a whole range of these issues. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Mark, you've been researching local government and indeed devolution for many years. There's always a sense in local government that we're at a crossroads, that things are changing fast. But do you think this moment does represent, particularly with the Devolution Act coming in, does this represent a real moment of change?
So I think this is a really interesting moment for local government generally. And I think there's a real contrast between the position of local government and the position of the mayoralties in England. So on the one hand, I think local government is really being treated by local authorities as in a holding pattern. I think that's understandable because the financial challenges that the sector faces are so huge, and it's very, very difficult to do more than keep the sector afloat. And you only have to look at something like the decision to meet the majority of the sector's deficit on send. That's £6.5 billion over a few years. And I think that can't have been an easy decision for the Treasury to make. And local authorities that's only one of the challenges they're facing. They're still at a real risk point. They're still facing a future in which demand is rising, funding is not keeping pace. There's ongoing threats of Section 114 notices still emerging. And we also have reorganisation on the horizon. That's going to cause a lot of organisational disruption. Will it make a huge amount of difference financially? There's a question.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think English mayoralties are in a very different position. I think the debate there is unrecognizable even from 3 to 4 years ago. And I get the strong impression from the government that mayoralties are regarded as where the action is. So they do interesting and sexy things like economic development and investment and transport. We know that they have really good access to government, to senior ministers, to a degree that the traditional sector can only dream of. Is this all changed by the Act? I mean, I think I'd say that the Act is probably one step in this sort of broader shift towards creating a tier of mayoral governance rather than providing a sort of real inflection point in the whole debate. There's a lot within what's been going on recently that's recognisably sort of continuity policy from the previous, the Johnson-Sunak Conservative government. We've got combined authorities, we've got mayors, we've got powers around growth and productivity and sort of adjacent functions. On the other hand, there are small but significant differences. And the government clearly sees mayors as a tier of government rather than sort of disparate collection of growth coalitions in certain parts of England. And as I was saying, central local relationships are different. You can argue about how far the difference in relationships is rhetorical and how far it's really being translated into practice. But I think that's a significant shift on the part of government. And a lot of its challenges at the moment are making that actually work across the piece.
Right. I mean, I agree with all of that. But in a way, the promise behind the bill was the sense that mayors are where the action is. So let's have mayors everywhere. Let's have mayoral strategic authorities across the whole of the country. When the bill was launched, there was this big fanfare about that, and we're going to do this. And if places don't do it, we're going to knock heads together and make them do it. But in reality, it feels to me what we've ended up with is an LGR process, originally sort of intended as being enabling for devolution. That's going ahead, and we can perhaps talk more about some of the challenges to that in a minute. But ironically, the devolution part of it all seems to have slightly taken a back seat in those areas where there aren't existing mayoral authorities. And we're now looking at foundational strategic authorities as a precursor to mayoral authorities, but no very clear kind of route map between the two. Does it feel as though the ambition of the bill is somewhat under realised in that sense?
I think it does, and I think there's a couple of aspects of this. I think we can't underestimate how important the resignation of Angela Rayner was actually in this. And there was a sense that rather than this being a policy that was pursued enthusiastically, it was a policy pursued because it was a policy and it had to be gone through with. And I think, as you hint, Jonathan, that meant that there was a bit of a change of emphasis between mayoralties and LGR. And LGR is something that has a statutory process. We know, so once the starting gun has been fired, we know what has to happen, clearly ensconced in the law. Whereas mayoralties, they're kind of a movable feast, and that I think the entire sector and central government as well is gradually working out what they are for. I think
Yeah.
there is a clear answer to what they are for, but I think that working through what they're for and how that fits into the more traditional parts of the sector is a long-term prospect.
Let's talk about LGR a little bit. I mean, we've got, as you say, it's a process that is now working through. You and I are talking now in, mid-June. We're expecting decisions on the remaining LGR areas in sort of mid to late July. We've now seen a delay on the structural changes order, so they're coming in the sort of the autumn and the winter. What do you think the status of that process is? A lot of people are asking, is that set in stone and it's just a process that now runs? Or is it a process that is vulnerable to change politically, either locally or nationally?
I mean, there are different ways of looking at this. I mean, I think in political terms, I think the government would do everything it can to keep the process on the road. It's committed too much political capital to it to turn back easily. I think in sort of processual terms, there've been 3 or 4 pre-action letters before judicial reviews from some of the authorities. You can never say never with these things, but I think it's going to be very difficult for a successful judicial review to happen. You have to remember, looking back just 5 years to the Cumbria County Council's attempt at a judicial review. They sought judicial review on the basis that Cumbria was to be split into 2 unitary authorities, whereas just across the way in North Yorkshire, an enormous new single unitary authority was approved for what's now North Yorkshire
Yeah.
Council. And they were actually denied permission even to take a judicial review forward by the court. That's how weak their case was perceived to be. And I think that there is plenty of wriggle room in the statutory guidance that the government has produced. So I think it's really hard to see how any area is going to successfully get a judicial review through. That doesn't mean that having a judicial review or having some sort of court action couldn't delay matters a little bit. But then again, we've got a timescale which is working towards first elections for the new authorities next May 2027, and vesting day the following April 2028. That seems to me, I mean, I'm by no means an expert in the nature of the procedure, but that seems to me to build in quite a bit of slack if there was to be any kind of litigating of the points in the courts.
Which, of course, is what people in government are saying. But it's interesting that I mean, that reflection on past judicial reviews is really helpful, actually. I mean, similarly in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, there was a judicial review and reorganisation, which, again, didn't in the end it didn't cause a delay, caused a bit of additional stress in getting to the sort of final point. Let's come back to devolution. So we've got the devolution priority programme, which is still on track to have mayoral elections, or still intended to have mayoral elections in 2028. We've then got another round of places working to the same local government reorganisation timetable, but being asked to express interest in foundational strategic authorities. One of the sort of intents of the bill was to have devolution everywhere and to move beyond a sort of deal-based, place-by-place basis to a sort of standardised format. Where do we see that going? It feels like we're still very much in an era of deal-based devolution that doesn't feel that dissimilar to what we saw under previous governments. Is that a fair comment?
I mean, I would personally be a little bit more positive about it than that. I think On the one hand, we're not in an era where there is a conceit that every deal for every different area is bespoke, and that was very much a core
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
idea of the devolution deal. Um, Originally under George Osborne and latterly under the Conservative governments, that it was a bilateral negotiation between the government and areas that wanted to do specific things. And so all deals would be slightly different. I mean, in reality, there was very little difference between them.
Yeah.
There tended to be particular options that were on the table, and particular options that weren't. What we've got now is the devolution framework, which is not in the bill, by the way. It's not a statutory matter, but it's in the
That's
white paper. But we know that there are different categories of strategic authorities. So we've got the established mayoral ones, we've got foundation strategic authorities, and we've got single foundation strategic authorities, which are where you designate a unitary authority, such as Cornwall, as a foundation authority. Now, we know that each of those classes of authority is supposed to have the same powers, so that the powers within the class of foundation strategic authority, whatever they are supposed to be the same. I don't think that this is merely a deal-based arrangement. Having said that, I do think that the government has lost its way slightly in the way that it has moved towards actually making this happen. So the foundation strategic authorities, there was a call out in February for areas which don't have mayoralties to propose foundation strategic authorities and to propose what the geographies should be on which those are established. So when in this whole debate, when you get to the point at which people start having to talk about boundaries, you always get into a bit of trouble. And I think that it's one thing that happened with the bill is that very, very late on, when it was in ping pong between the two houses of parliament, so at the very final stages, the government dropped its
yeah.
powers to compel areas to establish mayoral authorities, and it dropped its powers to compel areas to accept a designation of foundation strategic authority. So
Yeah.
we've now actually got a situation in which it would be possible for an area which didn't want any part of any of this to simply not engage. That
Yeah.
means that it's possible for the map not to be completed. It's
Yeah.
possible for this tier of government not to become finalised. And I think that makes it very difficult for certain aspects of the agenda to be taken forward.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to ask you about that because that does feel one of the big changes. I mean, when the white paper was launched, I remember Angela Rayner saying, and I think I'm broadly quoting, that we want everywhere to have, do devolution. We want places to come forward and lead this themselves. But if they do not, we will give ourselves the power to, I think she's literally used the phrase, to bang heads together and make them do it. They have not given themselves that power in the end. And that, as you say, that must surely open up a risk of, that ambition to complete the map not being realized.
Yes, I think it does. And I think that is problematic because, again, in complement to this, one of the aspects that I think has changed between the previous government and this one is that this government came into office far more treating mayoralties as a tier of government, as I was saying, rather than a slightly random collection of growth coalitions around the country. If we are in a position where there's no compulsion, I think what then happens is that the nature of the powers that are on offer to local areas at the foundation level or at the mayoral level, whatever it is, becomes quite a lot more important. There are a few areas of England which have never proposed devolution. For some reason, Worcestershire is on my mind here. I've never seen a proposal for devolution from Worcestershire. There's a few others which didn't engage in the early days of this government. But I think to get areas like that to take an interest and to want to do devolution in a situation where there's no compulsion, what's on offer becomes really important. So I think we could easily end up in a situation where the map is not completed by the end of this parliament. That puts the whole process on the back foot, I think.
I'm sure that's right. And I also think you made the point that within each layer of strategic authorities, there's meant to be the same powers. But we also know that people are actively thinking and in each many of the potential foundation strategic authority areas, people are already saying, well, actually, but what we would like, and we'd like this bit added, and actually, we'd like this extra set of powers over here, and are starting to sort of lobby government around that. So I think it's also, I mean, who knows how it'll turn out, but I think the question of whether government will sort of hold the line on the sort of flatness of those layers, or whether you will end up with quite bespoke deals around different foundational strategic authorities also seems to me as to be determined. Yeah, and again, one could argue that that's fine. There's no reason why they should be the same. There is a perfectly good argument for saying devolution should be bespoke. It should be different in different places, but that isn't. I think government's intent will be tested there.
I think so, and I think that's the point at which it becomes clear that government, as everybody knows, is not a single monolithic organism. So
Yeah.
if you have different areas which are seeking different powers, that has to be managed by MHCLG, who are the negotiating team essentially. But MHCLG is also managing outward to other government departments and trying to convince them that they should devolve powers devolve powers to certain areas and certain powers to other areas, and this is why they should do it. That's the real sticking point, I would say, at the moment, because there is by no means a cross-government consensus that devolution is desirable or that it's a policy priority. There isn't currently somebody with a big enough stick at the centre in order to make that happen. I was talking to somebody from the Treasury last week who was telling me that essentially they experience mayoralties coming to them saying, can you make these departments play nicely with us, devolve things to us? And the Treasury have to say, well, we can't really. We can tell them what to do with their money, but
Yeah.
we can't make them devolve powers. And this is the point at which a real central government push would be needed for something significant to happen. And at the moment, we're not seeing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess not to be too cynical, but historically, the ability of MHCLG and its sort of predecessor departments to push other big spending departments in that direction has been limited.
Yes, I think that's the case, and you can kind of see this in the various reform proposals knocking around the Home Office for the police and around DHSC for the integrated care boards at the moment. There's kind of a bit of rhetorical nodding to the role of devolution, but there is also a very strong sense that there are operational considerations which are going to drive how bodies get merged with one another, and those are paramount. So how that plays out again, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion.
No, and I was going to ask about this 'cause obviously, the act does bring in you know, local growth plans. It gives mayors some new ways to sort of try and influence other public bodies operating in their areas. But those tend to be kind of the right to kind of request a meeting or the right to kind of get a response. I mean, do you think those are powerful enough? So you sort of talked about the challenge at the national government level. Do you think the act gives mayors? I mean, being positive about the act and where we have mayors, does it give them powers to actually really drive change at a local level where it involves trying to coordinate and coerce and influence and persuade other local bodies?
I think potentially it does. I think that those are really interesting aspects of the acts, and they go back to a kind of a contradiction that I can remember noticing for the first time about a quarter of a century ago when I started out in this field, which is that there was even back then around the regional development agencies and the regional chambers under John Prescott, there was this sort of idea that there would be strategies locally and public bodies would just fall in with the local strategies drawn up by local leaderships. And what happened, of course, was that public bodies said, well, we have to follow the strategic imperatives of our national office. And so if those differ from what is wanted locally, the imperatives of our national office are going to take precedence. And I think it's really valid and important that the Act recognises that that tension exists. Is it possible that it will change the way things are actually done? I think it probably is possible. How that would happen in practice, I don't think we really know until it gets tested out. To take an example, the local growth plans legislation, which is in Schedule 22 or something of the
Mm.
Act, it says that a list will be drawn up of local public bodies that have to have regard to the local growth plan in terms of central government shared priorities that come up in the local growth plan. So the implication is that if you're a health body or a police authority, you would have to have regard to what has been put in the local growth plan by the mayor when you're making your own decisions. Now, that potentially is quite revolutionary because it means you've got a mayoralty locally, which doesn't control the health board, but is able, in certain respects, to frame the decisions they make. And that's quite an interesting, quite a neat way of doing things because it kind of circumvents the need for a mayor to say,
Mm.
well, what should really happen is I should be controlling the health service in my area. That rapidly becomes a massive national political issue and
Mm.
nothing gets done. And this is a way around that. How it actually pans out in practice, I think it remains to be seen, and I suspect will be determined to a large extent by the politicized behavior of the mayor. Would a mayor say, well, if you go ahead and do this thing which I don't like, it's possible we might seek to challenge it on the basis that you haven't had regard to my strategy. You can imagine some
Yeah.
sort of negotiation proceeding around that kind of idea. You might not get a challenge, you might not get a legal challenge, but the threat of it might concentrate minds. That would
Yeah.
be how I'd see that working.
And there's also i.e., the mayor, have a direct mandate from the people of this place, and I will be going back to them and telling them that you're not listening to them via me. It's interesting. It's somewhere between hard and soft power, isn't it? Sort of,
Absolutely. Yes, it's
yeah.
exactly that.
I mean, the other thing that's really of interest to us at LGIU, obviously, is one of the other bodies in that sphere. Are local authorities. I think we have seen again when you go back to the sort of Osborne era, the original mayoral deals. There was a lot of sort of, well, the mayor is just first amongst equals. They're just the combined authority is the thing. Whereas in fact, I think we've seen that mayors are able to exercise significance often. Do you think there is potential for sort of tension and kind of structural standoffs between local authorities, particularly if we're moving towards bigger unitary authorities and mayors? And what do we need to do to sort of beat that?
It's very difficult to say. I think that I mean, I would say, as a academic researcher of sorts, this is one of those areas where I'd love to say more research needs to be done because we really don't know that much other than anecdote about how combined authorities actually work together. Because obviously, a combined authority is made up of a directly elected mayor and a member from each of the local authorities in the area. So they each have one vote, and it is possible for local authorities to vote down something that the mayor would want to do. So how that has all worked up till now is something that would be really interesting to find more about. And I think also mayors have been so focused on building up their organizational capacity and wrestling with government for more powers that in a way I think that their relationship with local government could be said to have taken a back seat.
Mm.
There's also, of course, the splintering of political parties. We're getting more mayors of different political colours. We're
Yeah.
getting more examples of cohabitation, where the elected mayor is of a different party to one or more of the local authorities. It's easy to forget that the system that we've got was basically designed for Greater Manchester, where 8 or 9 out of 10 of the local authorities were always Labour, going back
Yeah.
to 2014. And the system we've got wasn't designed to broker large political conflicts between different parties. We're still learning about how that works.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I remember, I don't know, back in 2018, 2019, doing sort of relationship work in the West Midlands where you had some variation, Labour authorities and
Mm.
Conservatives and a Conservative mayor, and that was quite challenging. And that was challenging in a context that now looks incredibly sort of um, less complex and challenging than the context we now have. But look, we're talking a lot about kind of structure, governance, etc. You know, if we sort of take a sort of positive interpretation of the difference that we think this can make, more mayors, more foundational strategic authorities, more combined authorities. What thinking about it from the other end of the telescope, what difference does this make to people? I'm a citizen of Essex, seeing LGR going through, expecting a sort of mayor of Greater Essex to come in and as part of a mayoral strategic authority in 2028. And yes, we've talked about all the kind of bumps there could be along that road, but assuming that all goes ahead, what's in it for me? How does this make the world better?
Well, I think this is a really difficult question to answer, right? And I think it has the potential to be a threat to the agenda in the long term. And I think that is because so much of what mayors do is it is very much kind of background policy. It's kind of planning of things, it's strategy writing, doling out money to certain organizations, to housing development, to further education institutions. We have a policy field which we call economic development, which really consists of giving money to certain things rather than other things. And these decisions don't touch the vast majority of the population overtly in the way that things like the school system or the health service do. So it's quite difficult for people to understand. It sounds a very patronizing way of putting it, but it just is difficult unless you have a lot of time and knowledge to understand what mayors do. I think one thing we really do miss at the moment is the existence of a strong narrative as to this is why mayors are here, this is the kind of thing they're going to do, and this is the difference they're going to make. Now, saying all that, there's a few exceptions, I think. I think the biggest exception is transport, right? Transport touches the majority of people, especially if you're in a large conurbation like Manchester or the West Midlands or London, but all over the country. The mayor typically has quite a bit of control over authorities, and you've seen visible changes. It is not an accident that Andy Burnham's name has been connected so strongly to the B network,
Yeah.
because there are buses, they're out on the streets and they're yellow and people see them. And I can remember exactly the same thing being true of the London mayoralty in its first couple of terms. One of the main talking points about what Ken Livingstone did back then was around transport for London,
Yeah.
around improvements to the bus service, the tube, because it's something that touches the majority of people who live in London. What happens there has a major effect on public views of what mayoralties are for. And I think that's almost inevitable. And I think it makes an argument for any mayoralty to have at least one seriously high profile set of powers through
Yeah.
which it can be judged. Otherwise, they do just perceive to just stay in the background. You saw exactly the same problem, although it's a very different context, with the regional institutions under the Blair Brown administrations. When somebody came to power who wanted to abolish them, nobody knew what they did, and so they had no defenders, and that's a weakness.
That's really interesting. Well, I mean, I agree with all of that, although it is also an indication of how centralized we are. Because, when people like me get really excited about it, great, the mayor of Manchester can control transport in Manchester. I mean, good. Say that to someone from Paris or Berlin or New York, and they look at you like you're like, well, what do you mean? Who did it before? Some
Yes.
people 200 miles away and by the Thames. The fact that that is a sort of that we see that as progress tells us something about where we started. Which brings me on to, I did want to ask you about fiscal devolution, which many have argued, I mean, including me, to be transparent, that if you want real devolution, there has to be a degree of fiscal devolution that goes with it. And, we've seen the Chancellor of the Exchequer recently committing to a roadmap to fiscal devolution, but we don't see much of it in this bill, in this act, do we?
No, no, and I mean, I would not expect to see it in the Act as such, because it's a very big topic, and there are certain procedural issues around actually getting it done, assuming that somebody wants to do it. Probably slightly more skeptical than the average about whether fiscal devolution is needed for real devolution. I would say that it's probably sufficient money from whatever source is more important than where it comes from. And I think that's there's a whole other discussion about money in the English context. And Tony Travers once said the English government needs to get away from the idea that you can get £100 job for £70, and I think that's something that features time and again in any discussions about funding
Yeah.
sub-national government of any kind. I mean, fiscal devolution, it can take a variety of forms. We've got the overnight visitor levy coming in. There are certain powers for mayors around community infrastructure levy, small powers to raise a portion of council tax. It's my understanding that latterly the government is looking at devolving a share of income tax and possibly a share of business rates to mayoralties. And the idea is that that would replace funding that they already get. It wouldn't be additional. And then they'd be able to keep the rises in those revenues if and when they rose over a subsequent financial year. There are complexities around that. There's a question of what happens if the amounts raised fall. There's a question of should there be equalization between areas, and how do we work out how that would work and how much equalization should there be. Really important that a fiscal devolution system that we do have is well designed and it's clear what it's trying to do, because I do not think it's a panacea for effective government. There are many reasons why. I think I'm probably being a bit unfair. I think there is a, a, a good case for having a stream of revenue which can be relied upon. Of course, mayoralties in particular experience this because mayoralties have always survived. They've always received 80% plus of their funding from short-term grant programs. At best, they'll have a 5-year grant program, so there's a little bit of certainty there. But if they had some sort of system where they knew year on year what they're going to get and how they could forecast it, then the argument is that that enables them to invest with greater reliability in particular programs. It enables them to borrow because investors and financial institutions see them as a better risk, and it gives them financial stability as organizations. Because again, if you're on a series of 5-year grant programs, how do you know when those grant programs come to an end whether you're going to be able to keep in place the excellent team that you've built up to deliver whatever it is? And all of those very basic sort of organizational concerns are almost more key than the principle that if you have fiscal devolution, that's better.
Right. And at the risk of being pompous, you're also reconnecting finances with local democracy.
Yes, I think that definitely is true. Although I would sound a note of caution there that if you have equalisation, that does erode that link, and it's difficult to see them. And I think this is more true in local government than at the mayoral level. It's difficult to see a form of fiscal devolution in which you'd not have some form of equalisation. How much you have and how it's done is another question.
I mean, it's certainly whether you can see a way of doing that in practice or not. I think you can't see a way of doing it politically. And the risk is that we always end up in this very English fudge where we have neither full-throated fiscal devolution and kind of financial autonomy for areas, nor do we have a proper funding system from central government.
Yes. Although in truth, that's what you see in most countries. Looking at the work we've been doing together, places like Germany, France, Italy, there are all sorts of revenue sources at the local level, and they probably contradict one another in their effects, and that doesn't seem to crash their systems. I think there's more the sense of balancing a degree of autonomy with a degree of localities being required to deliver certain universal services.
Okay, Mark, final question. Thinking about all of these things and more, a lot of people watching this will be senior officers in local government, will be senior councillors in local government. What advice would you give to them right now about what are the biggest opportunities to be seized and what are the biggest risks to be avoided in terms of this agenda?
Oh, it's a difficult one, and I always feel uneasy answering a question about giving advice because I've never worked in the sector myself. I think probably the biggest opportunity is that my sense is that ministers and senior officials within central government are listening and taking on board concerns more than they have done in the past. That doesn't mean they're always going to act on those concerns or that it gives any guarantees of good outcomes. But I think there's much more of a sense that ministers regard mayors and local authorities as part of the team, part of sort of a shared challenge of doing things well. Having said that, there is no doubt that Whitehall is engaged in a sort of a fight with itself to actually make this happen, partly because of recalcitrance in certain departments, partly because there's certain genuine conceptual obstacles, basically around the sort of accountability and trust of local areas. And I don't know how those overcome other than a lot of thinking, a lot of talking, and over a lot of time. So it's not easy to say.
And as always, the risk and the opportunity feel like two sides of the same.
Yes, yeah. We've got a long history in this country of councils spending a lot of time trying to talk central government round to certain things, being told that there'll be consultation, there'll be a consultative body or whatever it is, and nothing much coming out of it. So I think there's a real trust issue there. There's no doubt about that. So I think sometimes central government really underestimates how much of a deal that is, partly because there are a lot of people who don't stay in post in any central government departments for any length of time, so they don't have that kind of historical awareness.
And very few people in central government who have much experience of local or regional government. So
Yeah.
that's changing it. I mean, ironically, quite a lot of people in local and regional government who have experience in the centre, but doesn't seem to go the other way around very often.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and certainly that's being borne out at the moment with a lot of appointments to mayoralties coming from people who have central experience.
Right. We are, as ever, defeated by the clock. Mark, that was a fascinating tour de force of a sort of run through of a really complex agenda, but one that matters to everyone in local government, given the ambition to sort of complete that devolution map, but also by extension to everyone in the country, because the shape of the way in which we are governed is changing around us, potentially quite fast. It's really important to try and understand that. So hugely grateful for your time, Mark, and for your expertise. Thank you to you. Thank you to everyone for watching and listening, and stay tuned for more of these interviews, which will be coming very soon.